Welcome to the Great Basin Seasonal Outlook for May through August. Here's a look at our Great Basin fire activity currently as of early May. You can see still quite a bit of prescribed fire occurring across the Great Basin indicated by the pink dots, but also a few wildfires popping up, and this occurs each day, although remaining on the smaller side. However, there was a larger fire south of Salt Lake City in the brush, and that fire was just over 400 acres. So there still is potential out there, even this time of year, to get a few larger fires, especially on windy days. Looking at the temperature and precipitation for the last 30 days, you can see although temperatures were not as warm as the historic March we saw, they were still above normal over the eastern half of the Great Basin. Over western areas, temperatures were closer to normal and even just below normal in some areas of western Nevada up into southwest Idaho. Precipitation definitely changed from the very dry conditions we had across the west in March, with a pattern change that brought storm systems periodically through the Great Basin in April, and this did bring areas of above normal precipitation to many areas of the Great Basin. The only drier spots really were southern Nevada, parts of the Arizona Strip, and southern Utah, and then areas in the interior of the Great Basin across northeast Nevada, northern Utah, and into eastern Idaho. The precipitation since October 1st, you can see generally was below normal, although not super below normal. We were generally kind of in that 50 to 70% range, really across the Great Basin. And that was due to some helpful precipitation early in the season in October through December, and then what has been occurring in April. But around the periphery of the Great Basin, these are the areas that have seen some spots of near to above normal precipitation. Now, precipitation is important, not only how much falls, but when it falls, because that does factor into our fine fuel growth across the Great Basin. This image on the left shows where late season precipitation or precipitation that falls in the summer, especially the monsoon season, is most important for fine fuel growth. And those are the areas in blues and greens. And you can see for the Great Basin, parts of the Arizona Strip, even southern and eastern Utah, rely somewhat on this late season monsoon precipitation for fine fuel growth. Now, if we look at the precipitation we saw last summer, between July through September, you can see these areas were very dry. So we are not anticipating a large crop of fine fuel growth from the monsoon rains last year in Utah or the Arizona Strip. Now, if we look at the other season, the spring and winter precipitation, these areas on the left in orange and yellow is really where those areas are reliant more on that precipitation for fine fuel growth. And again, looking at our precipitation dating back to October 1st, you can see most of this area was below normal. There are some pockets, both in southern Nevada, which was mostly precipitation last fall, and then up into northwest Nevada and southwest Idaho, where this precipitation was just above normal, along with eastern Idaho and northern Utah, that could see some new fine fuel growth from the spring and winter precipitation. Now, that being said, although we did have dry conditions, since that pattern has changed in April, we will be watching this precipitation because this will be continuing into May. So we will likely see new fine fuel growth and green out prolonged going at least through the middle of May as this wetter pattern continues. So we'll be watching again these areas of southwest Idaho, northern or northwest and western Nevada, and even pockets further south where we could see some new fine fuel growth from this late spring precipitation. Looking at our snowpack, despite that precipitation was not historically below normal, and even in some areas near to just above normal, our snowpack is at record low levels and has really been so much of the season this year. And that is mainly because of when the precipitation fell and how it fell. So we're seeing values across Nevada and Utah and Arizona in the 10 to 15% percentile for snowpack this time of year. However, further north up into Idaho, where snowpack has been better much of the season, we still are at 50 to 60 or 70% across Idaho into Wyoming. So looking at when the precipitation fell, we had obviously a much wetter October, almost region-wide with the exception of southern Nevada. And then November was very wet across the southern tier, even into western Nevada. And then December was kind of a patchwork, but definitely not overall dry. But we did see that dryness emerge in January and really continue almost continuously with the exception of a storm in February through March. So this precipitation early on, although it was very wet, it was warmer. We saw higher snow levels, so we didn't really see the snowpack build up during this time, which is why our snowpack is so low. So once we dried out, it melted off quickly and we saw those numbers diminish. So looking at soil moistures, this is also very important for fine fuel growth. Without good soil moisture, you can't get consistent fine fuel growth or those tall grasses. So currently we are below normal. This is the soil moisture anomaly. So we're below normal across the southern half of the Great Basin, but actually above normal or near to above normal over parts of western and central Idaho. But if we look at how the soil moisture has changed over the last month, since the end of March, just with this wetter pattern, you can see the soil moistures have really increased across the Great Basin. So again, this will be setting the stage for green up to continue and for that new additional fine fuel growth. So in addition to the new fine fuel growth, we still have carryover from last year in areas of the Great Basin. This Great Basin rangeland fire probability really takes into account carryover grasses. And this is, again, only for the low elevations looking at fire probability. So these yellow, orange, red numbers, that's where fire probability is the highest. And again, this is just at low elevation areas considering fine fuel. So not including our mountain areas that we are concerned with for different reasons. This is just low elevation. So you can see the highest potential really is for carryover is in Oregon, but also pockets of northwest, northern Nevada, and even across southern Idaho. Now, if we look at the comparison going into last fire season compared to this fire season, you can actually see the map on the left for 2025 showed higher potential with the carryover consideration than what we have this year. So we will have maybe less carryover in some spots where we saw a lot more last year, but there still is a lot of standing dead forbs and grasses, especially across southern Idaho. So still some carryover to deal with. And then obviously the concerns with the new growth is what we're watching going through the spring. Quick look at the drought conditions. Drought has worsened, especially over the eastern half of the Great Basin. We now have severe to extreme drought in many areas of Utah, and even extreme to exceptional drought over parts of far northeast Nevada and southern Idaho, with a pocket of exceptional drought here on the border of Utah and Colorado. So outside of those more significant drought areas, we still have moderate to severe drought really region-wide. And in the areas that we are not seeing drought in parts of central Idaho and even southern Nevada, we are anticipating many of these areas for drought to develop as we go through the fire season. So this will definitely be a big concern currently when we have dry periods, but also as we emerge into the early part of the fire season. Looking at our flash drought, we look at this throughout the fire season to show shorter term changes in drought. The drought monitor is really good for longer drought patterns, but we tend to see a lot of changes in our fire behavior quickly when we see changes in the short term drought. So right now, despite the pattern change, we haven't seen as much moisture over the southern areas of the Great Basin. So the last 4 weeks, this is ending in late April, we still have a more significant drought categories in that short term drought in the south. We could see some of that change going forward with the wetter conditions moving in through May, as even southern areas will see some precipitation. So looking at other fuel conditions, some of our fire danger indices. First, looking at southwest Idaho up here in the top right, you can see, really you'll see this in all the charts where we saw our ERC values reach historic maximums and greatly exceed those values at times, both in January during a drier period and then in March, especially with the very significant heat wave we saw. However, recently, with the April pattern change, we have seen our fire danger values come down and really fluctuate around normal as storms move through. And you can see from the green forecast line, we are expecting ERCs to potentially go up again before another storm moves in to drop those fire danger values. And we're seeing similar trends over western Nevada, where fire danger values have come down and will again be kind of fluctuating around normal. In Utah, this is in the higher elevations, this top right image, the northern Wasatch, you can see really we've been sitting near that historic maximum or exceeding it really all winter. And that's because of the drier conditions. And even when we would get storms, the snowpack was so far below normal, our fire danger values were definitely much higher than what we would normally see during the winter season when we are blanketed with more snow. But even in the northern mountains, these ERC values have come down to closer to normal. And then we're seeing even similar conditions in southern Utah and the Arizona Strip. And so these conditions, where we'll again fluctuate around normal, probably will continue for the next couple of weeks, if not longer. So now we'll look at what's happening in the future and what we can expect to impact our fire season. So we do have a switch. We've been in La Nina for over a year and a half, which is where there's colder waters in the equatorial Pacific, and we are making this shift to not only El Nino, but probably a rapidly developing and very strong El Nino most likely. So what El Nino and La Nina is this area in the ocean that's surrounded by the black box there. That's the Nino region 3.4, which is what everybody talks about. This is what the area of the ocean that's looked at to distinguish whether it's La Nina or El Nino. And La Nina is when these ocean temperatures are cooler than average by a certain percentile, and El Nino is when they are warmer than average. So you can see looking at this video that the temperatures were cool as we started the year, and we've seen that gradual warming. We've seen much warmer temperatures outside of that Nino region off the Baja coast, which is a little bit further north, and then even off the South American coast. And that's typically how El Nino begins, as we see these warmer waters and they eventually migrate into this region. So we are expecting that to increase and El Nino to develop as we get closer to fire season. Here is the forecast, and these are all different forecast models. Again, any of the shading in red would be the El Nino region, and the deeper the red, the stronger the El Nino. And you can see really all the forecast models are trending those ocean temperatures upwards, and 70, 80%, if not more of the models all go into El Nino and a relatively strong El Nino. So that is what we are anticipating. And this is expected, especially as we get into the summer months and then fall and winter. And we do see many of our El Nino impacts in the winter, so we won't really discuss those impacts right now. It's a little bit too early, but we do see some impacts in the summer as well. We tend to see more of a presence of a trough along the west coast. That typically gives us some windier conditions for the Great Basin, but it also pushes the monsoon to the east or suppresses its development in the southwest. So that's all dependent on when El Nino develops. If it develops late and we get that trophy pattern late, we could actually see the El Nino or the monsoon develop relatively on time before the El Nino pattern really kicks in. So that'll be something we're watching, because obviously we are very reliant on that monsoon moisture or any moisture coming up from the south to put an end or a damper on our fire season in the Great Basin. Another thing that's very important in El Nino, with those very warm ocean temperatures, we tend to have an enhanced tropical season in the eastern Pacific. So that gives us additional moisture that could be pushed up into the Great Basin. We've seen that before with Hurricane Hillary, remnants of Hurricane Dolores, giving us really heavy moisture across the Great Basin. So that's a definite option and possibility this summer. So something we're watching. So those are ways that we could get moisture into the Great Basin that really helps us take the edge off what the potential looks like going into the fire season. So on the flip side, the Atlantic fire or the Atlantic hurricane season, just as a note, when we see El Nino, tends to be somewhat suppressed as opposed to the Pacific hurricane season. So that's just something to keep in mind. Now we'll take a look at the monthly outlook for May. This is from the Climate Prediction Center, and temperatures here on the left show above normal temperatures, and this will likely be the trend through the fire season. With these very warm temperatures in the Pacific, we tend to get very warm temperatures over land in the west. So I would say that's probably a certainty going through much of the fire season, is this presence of above normal temperatures. The more confusing part, and the part that's not as certain, is definitely the precipitation pattern in the west. I would say for May, we have fairly high confidence that we will stay on the wetter side for the Great Basin. And this image down here in the bottom right, this shows our monthly precipitation rank, and it ranks every month 1 to 12 from driest to wettest. You can see for the Great Basin, especially for the northern half of Nevada, Utah, into southern Idaho and Wyoming, these are some of our wettest months, May. So again, even if we have normal precipitation forecast, that would still indicate wet conditions. So I would say at a bare minimum, that's probably what we're going to see through May, with this wetter pattern that storms bring periodic precipitation through the region, at least through the first half of the month, if not longer than that. There is somewhat of a drier signature on the forecast up north in central Idaho, and I would say there's pretty low confidence in that right now. But normal for the southern areas of the Great Basin would still be pretty dry. This is maybe our second driest month of the year down in southern Nevada and southern Utah. I will say it still looks like we will get some precipitation down in the southern areas, but certainly not as much as if you go further north in the Great Basin. As we get into the June through August time period, definitely a lot more flies in the ointment that could tip our precipitation one way or the other. So across the top row here, these are our monthly precipitation ranks for June, July, and August. And you can see for June, definitely the driest month over the southern half of the region, but kind of more middle of the road or just getting into the dry season up north. And then as we get into July and August, that's where the northern portions of the Great Basin get into the driest months of the year. And then it flips with the monsoon, where August is the wettest month for the Arizona Strip and southern Utah. So now looking at the forecast, keeping what's normal in mind, obviously temperatures we won't talk much about because we are expecting to stay in that above or well above normal range with the warm ocean temperatures. However, precipitation, it's looking like maybe a normal start to the monsoon, both in area and maybe timing in the southwest. And this may be due to El Nino developing, or at least the effects from El Nino developing a bit late. And then by August, again, this looks like more of a traditional progression of the monsoon. I will say confidence is pretty low on this forecast on if we do see that monsoon develop as early as what these forecasts indicate, and then if it's actually a normal progression. I would say June I feel like will be dry across the Great Basin. I think we'll make that switch from this wetter type of May. We'll either make that switch late May or June, where we'll see conditions dry out. But July maybe continue to some extent. August definitely more uncertain. Again, with the monsoon forecast, pretty low confidence. And then any of that tropical moisture, if the tropics and the eastern Pacific with the very warm waters of El Nino really get going, we could have more of that potential for these wetter conditions to really be further west into the Great Basin. So we'll be watching this as this will be a big driver of what happens to our fire season. Right now, we have a lot of potential going into the fire season, especially in those higher elevations with the lack of snowpack, and even in some lower elevations where we're seeing some carryover and some of that new growth. However, the summer pattern can make or break that fire season. So putting everything together, we do have generally normal conditions throughout May, the only exception being parts of the Arizona Strip and into southern Utah, as this area, even through May, looks to see on the lighter end of any precipitation, and some areas may even stay fairly dry. So considering we're coming out of this very dry winter period with snowpack, we do anticipate the southern areas to maybe get going as we move through the month. Otherwise, probably normal conditions through the rest of the Great Basin, again, due to this unsettled weather. The only caveat will be in those carryover grasses that are obviously dead and not compacted by snow in parts of northern Nevada, far northern Utah, and southern Idaho. Those we could see some grass fires that have some growth potential, especially on windy days, even during green up in some of these areas where that carryover is a little bit thicker, especially in southern Idaho. So that will be the only caveat to May, but this will be very event driven. And with the moisture moving through those drier periods, we'll have kind of shorter time in between. As we get into June, this is really when we anticipate maybe that page to shift back to a drier regime. So we are anticipating the above normal to expand fairly rapidly in the higher elevations of Utah and the Arizona Strip and into the spring mountains of southern Nevada. So again, this is mainly high elevations, as we talked about, not expecting much new fine fuel growth in these areas. However, I will say when we do shift to that drier pattern because of the lack of snowpack, these fuels will dry out much more rapidly than what we would see in a normal season where we have that gradual snow melt or even rapid snow melt. We just don't have much snow to melt in these areas. So do expect that page to turn a little bit faster. And we will be watching these areas in northern Nevada and southern Idaho. Even in June, if we do get a really hot, dry period, those grasses could pose a bigger problem before some of the brush and even higher elevations dry out. So we may have to add some above normal for June, but right now confidence is pretty low, so we'll just be watching those areas. But by July, we have a lot of areas blanketed, both for the high elevation concerns and the areas we already talked about with that fine fuel component. Also, the Sierra Front, kind of a mix of both of those issues. So we will be, again, watching these areas. And I will caveat July, if we have additional moisture move in quicker, some of these areas may change. And the same holds true for August. We kind of tried to show that progression where we do expect the moisture to be more likely in Nevada and Utah as we get towards that later July and August time period and less likely for Idaho. So right now, even if we get those tropical systems, I would say we'd have to be pretty lucky for it to extend to the north. So we still do expect an active fire season, probably more likely than not, regardless of the moisture for parts of Idaho and Wyoming. So looking at the national perspective, just to see what will be going on around us, we will definitely not be the only geographic area busy as we go into the fire season. The Southwest will start getting busy in the May and June time period. And then as we get into the meat of the fire season, our neighbors in California, Pacific Northwest, Northern Rockies, and Rocky Mountain, we are all dealing with the same record low snowpack and very dry conditions in the higher elevations. So that would be a big concern going into our fire season this year. That concludes our monthly forecast. Check back next month for the latest updates.